Hey guys, my name's Crystal Kenny, and I'm in love with creating. All things artistic and imagination involved. I'm an American girl who chased her creative dreams all the way to Paris, France, making a living using photography. This podcast takes you inside the stories of all the artsy folks I've met along the way and gives you that extra push to discover your creative gifts. The desire to create is deeply inside each and every one of us, and I give you the tools and inspiration to find a new way of living a more creative life. This is La Vie Creative, the podcast. Today on the show, I interview Calvin Shields. Calvin is originally from the UK, but has spent much of his time in France, where he was a pilot and traveling all around the world during the golden age of travel, as he put it. He's recently published his own first novel about his life and all the adventures of flying around the world. We talk about writing, France, World War II, and much more. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. So welcome to the show, Calvin. How are you today?
Hi, Crystal. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm great. Thank you for inviting me to be part of your show.
After reading your bio, I feel like we have a lot to talk about. You have lived about 20 lives in one life, so we have so much to talk about. But I want to go back to the beginning about what brought you to France and where you're originally from.
Okay, that's a good question, because my father was in the Royal Air Force, and as a kid, every 3 years we were stationed somewhere abroad. Although I was born in England, I've spent a lot of my life, my early life, traveling throughout the far-flung corners of the old British Empire. So I am British. I was born in England, and then eventually, after I had to go to a boarding school in England, and after I left boarding school, I started to fly. I learned to fly with BOAC, as it was in those days, which became British Airways. And of course, in those days, a job was for life. And so I stayed with British Airways until I had to retire at 55. So that's very basically my initial, if you like, my initial career. After that, I was able to continue flying with Singapore Airlines for 7 years. And I finally finished with TNT, which is a freight company based in Liège. Up until I had to retire at 65. And in answer to your question, why did we move to France? Well, in 2000, we decided, my wife and I decided that we wanted a change. She is fluent in French. She'd been to university in Switzerland, and she was very keen to move to France. And so that's where we are. We came here in this area, which is between Grasse, Cannes, Nice area, in the year 2000.
That sounds lovely. So you've been there for over 20 years already, and sounds like a great place to retire. Not too bad after all that travel you were doing.
Yeah, it is. I was still flying, of course, when we first came here. But the advantages of living in France, for me, I love the mountains. And where I live, I'm literally, they call it the arrière-pays, the back country in France. And the mountains behind me are literally 5 minutes away by car. The sea is just 20 minutes away by car. So I'm between the coast and the mountains. The mountains are what interests me most of all. There's absolutely wonderful walking around here. Inspirational, of course, because the views are unbelievable. The history around here is also extraordinary. And the weather, of course, everybody knows the weather in the UK is not great. So here we have a much more stable weather, nicer weather, if you like. So yeah, all in all, it's been great.
Yeah, and I know that when I read your bio, you had some crazy stories from the golden age of travel, as you put it. Talk a little bit about some of those experiences of flying through wars and some of the other things that happened during those times.
It's we don't really have enough time on this interview to cover everything, but suffice it to say that I was fortunate enough to start flying at the age of 18 as I left school in what I guess was the end of the so-called swinging 60s. And I would suggest also that it is the golden era of aviation, where jet travel suddenly became, or international travel more accurately, became much more available to many more people. And of course, in the early days, I would guess it was a fairly romantic thing to fly any distance. Actually, when I first started I actually started flying commercially large aeroplanes at the age of 19 or nearly 20. It was only royalty, film stars, and government officials who actually flew.
Wow.
And then I guess I started flying commercially in 1969, but by the mid 70s, if not slightly earlier, Freddie Laker, who was an entrepreneur in England, he developed this concept of cheap flying, and effectively he started being able to offer tickets at very cheap prices. So suddenly the world of aviation expanded, allowing just ordinary people to be able to have long distance holidays. And I say the golden age because it was romantic. I also would suggest that during that period there was much less control. We didn't have the recording systems. We didn't have the reporting systems. If you like, we weren't spied on as much. That's probably the wrong word, but we weren't controlled as much as we were now. Now it's much more organized, much more rigid, much safer. But in the early days, all of these, if you like, rules and regulations were being formulated, and so we had a lot more freedom to do things that most certainly were not allowed to be done today. For example, we quite often would descend a little bit and fly around Kilimanjaro to give the passengers a view if we're going down to in Africa, or we would similarly in the middle of Australia. There's Ayers Rock. It's changed its name. I don't know what it is now, but we would descend down a little bit. Go down about 10,000, 15, 20,000 feet, circle around the rock, and then carry on our journey. It was. Oh, and another one too, very much so, was Cape Town in South Africa, where they allowed us to, or it was okay for us to fly after getting airborne, after taking off a relatively low level, let's say 1,500 feet, and give the passengers a view of Table Mountain. So it was romantic. It was much less. There was no security in those days either. So you weren't controlled very much by having to wait in line to get your bag searched and so on. So yeah, it was a very interesting time to be part of aviation.
Yeah, I'm very jealous right now because now flying is maybe one of my least favorite things to do after dealing with the security and some guy's feet in my face for 8 hours. That sounds much more romantic, flying over Kilimanjaro, like having
yes, it was. And the other thing too, Crystal, is that at that time the world was very much in turmoil. The Middle East was a problem because it wasn't long after the Yom Kippur War of 1967, if my memory serves me correctly. There was a lot of problems with hijacking, and they hadn't really worked out the security measures for that. But from my point of view, I was involved in Uganda, in Africa. A dictatorship was set up by a guy called Idi Amin, who you may not have heard about. But for me, I was arrested by him. Not me. The four of us on the flight deck were arrested by him. We were accused of smuggling weapons into Uganda, and we were thrown into a jail in the middle of Uganda, which was not very pleasant. Wow. I've also seen starvation, for example, in Calcutta. Not in Calcutta. It was in Calcutta. I beg your pardon. It's now called Kolkata. When the harvest failed on the west side of India, I saw kids dying in the street in the early 70s, which was absolutely tragic. On top of that, I've experienced all sorts of, hurricanes, typhoons, wonderful natural phenomena like the Northern Lights. I've had technical problems with the airplane, engine failures. I've had all sorts of things like that. And then to cap it all, the weirdest of all is I had somebody jump in one of my engines to commit suicide in 1990 in Trinidad in Port of Spain. So you could say that it is quite an interesting life, to say the least.
I would say, to say the least. I mean, when is the movie coming out, Calvin? I'm waiting for the movie.
Actually, that's very strange you should say that because a movie director, nothing's going to happen. I suppose it's called a pipe dream, but he's very keen to try and do some sort of Netflix adaptation of my book. But I personally don't think it's going to happen. But yes, it lends itself perfectly to something like, if I'm allowed to mention Netflix, where each chapter of my book could be an episode, and it's an interesting life. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And we're going to get to your book, but I just want to say I know that once you retired, you, as you put it, were bored after all these
Ah,
adventures. So you took it upon yourself to walk across Greenland in 4 weeks and then climb
yes,
a
I
mountain in Corsica.
Yes, I did, and this might be of interest to your listeners who are of a certain age. I was never prepared to retire. I was never going to retire. I was obviously not old enough, but of course, eventually it happened. And if you happen to be an airline pilot at the age of 65, you have to stop, even if you're perfectly fit. And I really felt I was at the top of my ability in my career when I reached 65. And at midnight, before my 56th birthday, I was 1 minute before, I was licensed to fly 550 people anywhere in the world. 1 minute later, I was not. And I would suggest, like most pilots, it's not so much of a job; it's a way of life. It's fantastic to be able to fly a 320-ton aeroplane onto a tiny piece of concrete in a howling crosswind. I'm sure you can understand that every time you do that, you get quite an adrenaline rush. Effectively, you get hooked on it. So when I retired at 65, a year later, I was quite depressed, actually. I really felt I didn't really have so much of a purpose in life, if you like. Nobody was phoning me up anymore, asking my opinion, and I felt not important. It was quite strange, really. So I decided I needed to do something different. I actually happened to be skiing on an icebreaker up in skiing, by the way, is my major passion. But I was skiing pretty close to the North Pole, well, 10 degrees from the North Pole in Svalbard. It's about as far north as you can get. On an icebreaker, sleeping on an icebreaker, and I thought, okay, this is not bad, but it's not exciting enough. And luckily, they seemed to have an internet connection on the boat. And then I saw, I just said, I'm going to do something really silly. I'm going to cross Greenland on skis. Now, I'd flown over Greenland hundreds of times in my career. It took 45 minutes to go from one side to the other. And I always had my nose squashed against the windshield, looking at the fjords, the glaciers, the snow, and so on. And I'd always wanted to visit Greenland, so I said, "Why don't I do something stupid and cross it on skis?" So I managed to find a company that was organising an expedition across Greenland the following year at 9,000 feet, and at the same time we're pulling a sledge of around about 85 kilos, and the excuse me, my computer's just gone off. There we are. I'm back now. Sorry. Yeah, we're pulling a sledge of about 85 kilos. Temperature's down to minus 40, and we sleep in a tent. And now, I'm saying that because it's the most ridiculous thing I've ever done, the most stupid thing I've ever done in my life, but yet it was the most wonderful at the same time. It's very difficult to explain that to anybody when they say you must be mad. Sure, I was. But by the time I got to the other side, I'd really achieved something that not many people, and certainly I'm not sure whether anybody above 66 has ever done it before. I was 66 years old. The other guys on the trip were 33. So
Wow.
there were 5 of us, by the way. So I got to the other side, absolutely wonderful, lost 17 kilos in weight. My wife was extremely happy with that. And, and then a year later, I'm afraid, of course, you get a huge amount of adrenaline from that. A year later, I was suffering from depression, worse depression this time. I use that word. I don't really know what depression is, but I felt really down. Okay. And so I thought, right, I need to do something stupid again. And so I decided to try and cross Corsica on skis. Now, most people don't know, but there is snow on Corsica in the winter. It's very heavy snow because it's quite damp, but the mountains are incredibly rugged, and it's a very difficult trail. So I set off Oh, by the way, I must say, just before, it's part of the story, the week before I set off, I'd done a writer's course in England, which is part of my story. So we set off, and I was 100 meters from the top of the second highest mountain in Corsica, and I had a stroke. And the most extraordinary thing was, okay, I was very dizzy and so on, but I was very angry because I've always been fit. I've never smoked. I don't drink that much and so on. And so I was stuck in the mountain for 2 days in the snowstorm without any care. And then eventually I was transported back to France, where I have fully recovered. However, now the important thing is, when I was in, and this is very, very relevant to our conversation, that when I was in hospital in Nice, the doctor said to me, she came in and she said, you do realize you've got a chance of having another stroke in the next few months. And as I lay there, I thought, I have no record of my life. I have no record of my experiences. And so I started there. Eventually, when they would give me a piece of paper, I started to write my book, which is effectively it's actually a story where I have my alter ego. I can't use my own name or other people's names, so I've created an alter ego. But I like to make people laugh, so it's in part a light-headed account of my life, where my character, my alter ego, is a clumsy, scheming cad. And I don't know if you've ever read George MacDonald Fraser. He wrote a series of very funny books about an anti-hero called Flashman, who was also a vain, cowardly, inept character. And I based my alter ego, on him. But the problem is, if you've got to write about, let's say, in my case, 50 years or 45 years of life, if you like, it's very difficult to try and keep a thread going throughout that period of time and keep it interesting. And that I found very difficult. But I somehow managed. So yeah, that's how it started. And I wrote the book a year later. I published it on Amazon. And it's since been published by Vanguard in the UK, and I've sold a few thousand copies. And there you go.
And the title of the book is "Dancing the Skies and Falling with Style."
Do you know what, Crystal? I'm very proud of that title because nobody understands it.
I love the title.
Well, I'll explain it. The first half of the title, Dancing the Skies, it comes from a poem which was written by a Canadian fighter pilot in the Second World War called John Gillespie McGee Jr. It's called High Flight. He actually copied, it's not his original work. I found out later he actually copied some of it from somebody else. But the first two lines, which is the first half of the title. I've got the poem in front of me, and it says, it's a lovely poem. If ever you get a chance to read it, I really suggest you do. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Okay, so Dancing the Skies comes from that part of the story, from that poem. And the second half of the title, Falling with Style, it comes from a Disney film, Toy Story. And I'm not sure if you know the story, but there's a toy called Buzz Lightyear. He really believes he can fly. Of course, he's a toy, and in reality, he can't. So he tries to impress Bo Peep and the skeptical Woody, and he tries to show her that he can fly, and he sort of, by combination of bouncing off a ball and being whirled round by a ceiling fan, he gives the impression of flight. Of course, Woody responds because he's jealous of Buzz. That's not flying, it's falling with style. So falling with style comes from that quote. Now, if you join the two together, what I think I'm trying to say, although my character in the book appreciates the beauty and the wonder of flight, at the same time, he was able to give the impression of being a steely-eyed aviator when often he was not. So my CAD character, my alter ego is a bit of a cad. At the same time, he loves the flying, but at the same time, he can't understand how he's able to do what he does, because he feels perhaps that everybody thinks he's steely-eyed, and in fact, he might not be.
Talk a little bit about the political correctness around your book. I know we mentioned that before we recorded.
Yes, it's an issue I'd like to discuss because, of course, my book it spans the end of the swinging 60s right the way through to the first two decades of the 21st century. Now, I'm a firm believer that we shouldn't rewrite the history. I'm not saying history is correct. I believe we should learn from history. And I'm certainly not an apologist for historical events. But of course, in the swinging 60s, we're very different from a political correctness point of view than we are today. So what I wanted to do, I want to tell, and I have told the story as it was. It may offend a few people, but I wanted to write an honest account of my life rather than gloss over what might be seen as unacceptable today. And of course, in some ways, it might reinforce why political correctness has become an important part of everyday life now.
Well, I think that's a great point to make and something that readers should really consider while reading your book, because I know we have this whole cancel culture today and the PC and all that. So I'm very fascinated to see it from your point of view. Well, I can't wait to read it. And I know that you're working on a second book as well. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I just want to talk a little bit about how you've done so many things. You seem quite fearless. And it feels like age has never been a boundary for you or an issue. So do you have any advice for people who feel like their age or circumstances are holding them back from doing what they want?
Well, you've asked the $64,000 question here, because I am a firm believer that you can do whatever you want, and age is just a number. So long, I've always had a sort of mantra. I think it's my own mantra in my life, is that the first thing about tackling anything is, first of all, you've got to have self-belief. You really do have to say to yourself, I've got the confidence to do this. That's number one. Number two, preparation. These days, with the information we have on the internet, information that we can get from talking to other people or experience things like, in my case, crossing Greenland or whatever, you get all of the information. Preparation is probably the biggest part of trying to manage anything. And of course, the last thing is the correct tools. You need to have the right tools to do a proper job. Don't go for cheap, useless tools. In the case of writing, I would suggest you need a really good word processor. You need a good, if you like, you need to have a nice environment to be able to write. For me, I like to be in the mountains. My ideal place to write is in a little cabin in the mountains where I'm not being disturbed. But you can apply that to anything you like. If you really want to do anything, I mean, a stupid example, send a rocket to the moon. You really could, if you had exactly that. Believe you can do it. Confidence is really important. Preparation, read up, work out how you're going to do it. And the third thing is make sure you've got the right tools, and you can do anything in your life. And age is quite literally just a number.
I think you've proven that over and over again in your lifetime. And I think the book will be a great example of that. And I want to talk a little bit about your new book that you're working on. It's going to be a historical novel based on the last few months of the Second World War, where there were various resistance groups that weren't quite seeing eye to eye, as you put it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. The first book I did, The Dancing the Skies and Falling with Style, I was very restricted by telling, if you like, a life story, and therefore there was no way I could move outside the constraints of the story. But of course, if you start writing a novel, it's a historical novel. If you then have the freedom to really do whatever you want. But I am also extremely interested in history, amongst other things, and in our area in the south of France. There is a lot of history from the Second World War. The area was liberated by the Americans, Canadians, and the British. I think off the top of my head, without my notes, it was in June 1944, if I've got it right. Of course, I was actually walking in the hills, which I do all the time. And in the middle of nowhere, I came across a plaque on the wall, which said in French, but that two brothers were killed by the Germans. In the middle of nowhere, and on a date in 1944. And I thought, wow, it was really sad. One was 18, 19, the other one was a little bit older. And I thought, why were they shot by the Germans in this desolate place in the middle of nowhere? So I did a bit of research, and I found out that the older brother was part of one of the various resistance. He was actually at the communist, franc-tireurs they were called, communist resistance group, and it said where they lived. They lived in Vence, which is a well-known town near me. And I was very sad about that. I thought, well, wow, I could. And then I started to formulate a story where the younger brother tagged along with the older brother to go on an adventure in the night, and he gets shot. And I thought, wow, that makes quite an interesting story. So I did a lot of research, and particularly into the resistance groups, the effect of what was called the Vichy government in the south of France in the latter part of the Second World War. Well, the Vichy government, which was basically collaborated, now I have to be a bit careful here, by the way, because I know that in France it is quite a thorny subject, the resistance and the Second World War. So I'm telling you this story, and I have to be a little bit careful whether or not it'll be exactly like this in the final book. I don't know, but there was collaboration between the Germans and the Vichy government. And the saddest thing. Oh, by the way, the other thing I found really interesting is that in Cannes they have opened up a museum which has a lot of stuff on the Second World War. And I got some information from here. But for example, I mentioned that there were three main resistance groups in the south of France, and they weren't in coordination. They didn't like each other very much, and they were always, telling the Germans who was who and so on. They were effectively not coordinated, and so. Now, the very last thing I want to say is that the Vichy government had two police forces. One was called the Milice, which were a really nasty bunch of people, and they had the Charlemagne Brigade, which was soldiers who had been captured by the Germans and they were offered the job to work for the Germans in the south of France. So they were basically the police. But my story, it involves these resistance groups. I've invented a character who's the head of the Gestapo in Cannes. All of it is very historically correct, by the way, absolutely correct. And I've even introduced Matisse in Vence, who did live in Vence in the Second World War. So I'm trying to. Oh, and by the way, the last thing is a special operations soldier is sent over. A Scottish guy is sent over to try and coordinate the resistance for the eventual invasion of the south of France. And so all of this is coming together. I've written about 10,000 words, but sadly I had to stop because I built a house. That's another creative thing I've done. I've just built and designed my own house. So sorry, I'm talking too much here. I apologize.
No, I mean, it just proves to our listeners you can have many passions. Because I think a lot of times we limit ourselves, we think, we can't do too many things. But you're the perfect example of that not being true.
I can tell you for sure there is no limit. I mean, I'll very quickly, I love carpentry. I built a harpsichord. I like music. I play music, classical guitar. I like photography. I've got a little gallery in my house. There are so many things, and you don't have to be good at what you do, because what is the definition of good? There is no definition, in my view, of what's good. What's good is what pleases you. It doesn't matter if people don't like your work. If you do, that's fine, so don't, in my view, anybody who's considering doing something, don't try and copy anybody else. Be yourself. And in that respect, you really do need to, look at things. For example, people look, but they don't see. You need to observe. When you look at a tree, look at the tree, look at the bark, look at the insects, look at the leaves, remember it and think how you could use that if you're going to write a book, or if you're going to take a photograph. Don't look at the tree, look at the big picture, not the small picture, or if you like, look close up rather than just seeing, everything that is vague, if you know what I mean. So, yeah, sorry, I'm going on a bit here.
I think that is great advice. I couldn't agree more that people need to take a closer look at things around them, especially when the creative world. And as someone who is obviously very creative, how would you define creativity in your own words?
Yes. Okay. That's a very good question. What does the word create mean? It means make, construct, or do something outside the norm, to be creative. We talk about creative speech or creative art as being something that perhaps isn't the norm. So to be creative means that you need to be able to to construct something, do something, make something new. And creativity is in everybody, in my view. Everybody has a story to tell. Everybody, if they put their mind to it, which I said earlier, would be able to be creative in one way or another, in my view. Creativity is everywhere. It's all around us. You just got to think, that's all.
And is there anything you would go back and tell your younger creative self?
Probably not write a book about myself. Yeah, I was absolutely useless at English at school. I failed all of my English exams, although I'd always had an interest in words. But in a way, I put that down to the teacher. So what would I tell my younger creative self? Get yourself a good teacher if you can for your English. Don't give up. I never did give up. I've always loved words. And strangely, I've always wanted to write, and I've only just had the opportunity. So, yeah, don't give up. And you can do whatever you want. Just have the confidence to do it. Write it down. Look at it. And the other point I would do is always proofread over and over and over again when you write something, because it took my first rendition of the book was longer than War and Peace. It was about 1,000 pages, and it's probably a lot less interesting than War and Peace, I might add. However, it takes a lot of courage to reduce it by 60%. So proofread. And the problem is you'll never be happy. So you need to stop at some time, get somebody else to read it. And then if they're happy with it, then stop.
I think that's fantastic advice to end with. And thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And where can people pick up your current book and connect with you online?
Yeah, you can. Absolutely. Yes, as I intimated earlier, I have never bothered really to promote my book. It was really, I guess, a little bit of a project for me to do. However, I do have a Facebook page for Dancing the Skies and Falling This Style. You can also find me on Instagram under Calvin Shields 01. I'm also LinkedIn. I did have a website, but I'm afraid that has elapsed, unfortunately. So yeah, there you go. The book is available on Amazon, and it's also available from the publishers, Vanguard Press. So there you go.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And we'll share all of that in the show notes so our listeners can click and pick up their copy and follow along on all your new adventures on Instagram. And I thank you so much for coming on the show today.
No, you're very welcome. I've enjoyed. I don't normally talk about this too much, so I really enjoyed talking to you, Crystal. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for tuning in to La Vie Creative. You can find more information on MissParisPhoto.com. And if you enjoyed this show, please feel free to share and spread the word for all my creative guests. We have the power to help them to keep doing what they love. See you next time.